All right. Hello, everybody. We're just going to give another minute here, let a few more people in, and then we'll get rolling here shortly. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today for another Frontier Precision webinar. Really excited to have our partner at Bridgemark Insurance Solutions with us today, covering protecting your assets in UAS business. I know we have a lot of customers that give us questions about insurance on their UAS platforms. And although we sell them, we are not insurance providers, and there's so many nuances within the space that we want to provide some value to you guys by bringing in our partner and our expert, Stacy, who will take over here in a second, covering the nuances of the insurance industry in part with UAS. A few housekeeping items. Everybody is muted today, but if you do have questions, we will be answering them during the presentation. So feel free to put those in the questions box, and we'll try to cover those while we're going along today. So a little bit about Frontier Precision. We're a 35-year-old company. We originate in the geospatial realm, but we also have our unmanned side of the house. Our team currently consists of about 25 personnel, experts across the entire industry and across the country. We do everything from UAS sales or unmanned sales, training and support. We also do help along with BVLOS operations, whether that's docks or just extended ops. And then we also do ROVs and underwater, under surface crawlers. Really excited to have everybody here today. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Stacy to take it away.
Hi, good morning. I'm Stacy Mesteth. I work for Bridgemark Insurance Solutions. I'm located up in Grand Forks, North Dakota, but I do operate nationwide. You know, this has been UAS insurance has come a long way. I've specialized in UAS insurance for at least the last 7-8 years. And it's amazing how the industry has changed, not only the UAS industry, but the insurance industry along with it. I will preface that by saying the insurance industry is about as opposite as you can get from technology, UAS, UAV. It is slow moving. The actuaries, otherwise known as, kind of bean counters, are notoriously slow in making changes to their industry. They want to gather, stats and information, and thankfully, there isn't a lot on losses yet, because aviation and drone insurance, unmanned specifically insurance, is not as of right now putting out a lot of high losses. But I think that one of those reasons being, and you can skip over another slide, Colin, is that last one. As of 2021, only 21% of commercial pilots owned any form of commercial insurance for their operations, and I think part of that is unmanned operations businesses really have started to come out of their startup modes in the last 5 years, and really starting to get into commercial operations. And I know I get some pushback from that, because I know a lot of people have been operating this space for quite a few years. When you think of the military and then commercial operations coming out from that, a lot of people have been operating them in that for, a decade, 15, 20 years. That being said, specific commercial insurance has been slow to respond to get policies in place, but their policies are in place. Can you skip, Colin? One of the things that I see a lot of people as they're starting to get into their risk management programs, right? Trying to develop, realizing they would like to transfer some of this risk, aren't always understanding of the specific UAS risks that could be covered, right? And what factors that lead to that loss. And UAS, because it's a combination of aviation and technology, have some specific specific loss reasons in our industry. So one of the highlights that we see is the lack of operational operational training and a company safety program. Smaller programs, smaller businesses don't necessarily always think that they need a safety program in place. And we've seen that as companies start to develop their own operational training and their company safety programs specific for their operations, that can lead to a lot more organization, and it can really help to cut down on what we like to call near misses. So, as you can see on their screen, some of the risk factors that we see that lead to loss are, failure of power systems mid-air that can cause crashes, software errors. One of the big ones, especially, if you're operating in a more rural area, is a loss or just delayed or distorted operating signals. And that can really, can go into more of the stereotypical losses, right? Falling from the sky, crashing into another a building, a vehicle, something along those lines. Cyber hijacking or spoofing has become a very big worry governmentally and in commercial operations. And that is the hijacking is starting to become a worry on our side as well by those bad actors. The ground losses, whether it be, that should say power source fire from your docking station, might be another cause of loss. So if you can skip over here. So when you're starting to develop your risk management program, right? Everybody thinks about how they want to run their business differently, how they want to transfer risk, which is in essence what an insurance program is, how you're going to transfer your risk by paying for an insurance policy. So I always ask clients how you would like to set up your risk management program long term, right? We all have goals about how we want our companies to grow, but how do we want them to grow? Do we want a larger fleet? Do we want more personnel? Are our facilities, are we going to have our own facilities, whether it be manufacturing, testing facilities? Maybe operations aren't year-round, but maybe you're thinking about traveling for operations to different parts of the country. And then one that we'll get into a little bit later in the presentation, but is operations driven by contractual obligations. So if you're a service provider and are you signing a contract that somebody else has set up and they're looking for services, or you do operate through your own contractual obligations that you have other people sign. And so thinking about those things can really start to make you think about how you want to start developing your risk management program. So if you want to move one more slide, Colin. Often when UAS operators think about insurance, they think about aviation liability. An aviation liability policy is a two-part policy that we're going to get into next. It is the liability that you have while you're in the air, as well as hull or physical damage coverage. Okay, and that's mainly what people think about when they think about getting insurance. And it is a big part, right? But it's definitely not the be all and end all of how you cover your whole business. And I really want to have people understand that when you start your risk management thought process, right? And I know that risk management is not the exciting part of business. I know not everybody was like, can't wait to hear Stacy speak today. I'm just jazzed to hear about this most exciting part of my business operations. But I do really believe that it's important for the long-term health and growth of a company. I often talk to people, and my first meeting with somebody is talking about a bail team and making sure that you have, you know, your bail team in front of you, right? And what that means is your lawyer, your insurance agent, your accountant, and making sure that they're all on your team. Okay, and I guess, sorry, banker, accountant, insurance agent, and lawyer. And finding people that specialize in unmanned operations can be difficult. Really having people have that knowledge is really important. And you know, I guess we'll get into a little bit of that coming up, but aviation liability is what people think about when they think about their risk transfer program. Aviation operations liability, or AVOL, is what most people think of needing is general liability, and that will cover their ground operations. That's not really the case for insurance in aviation, because although we've made great strides in commercial insurance in the past 5 years, the vast majority, and I would still say about 85 to 90% of commercial carriers still exclude all aviation operations. The remaining 10% have found ways to endorse exclusions back on. And that's a wonderful thing, and I'm saying that with the utmost sarcasm about insurance, is I often say you get your insurance policy, and the first couple of pages are telling what they'll cover and all of your operations and what they'll cover. Then the next few pages are the exclusions and what they're going to take away and not cover. And then if you look further down in the fine print, down towards the end, what they'll endorse back on, probably for more money, and then cover what they said they were going to in the first part, right? And that's the wonderful world that I deal with, but really making sure that you understand exclusions. And again, going back to that contractual obligation, right? The third part of that I find really important in a risk transfer program is your professional liability. So professional liability is really important, because professional liability is what covers you in the business that you're in for your knowledge, and it helps cover the financial losses that may result from your business. So for example, if you you're lucky enough to, you operate in the agricultural world, and we'll get into part 137 and some of that a little bit later, but when you were using UAS to to spray fields or spray, in a landscaping, and you get sued because something happened that was not meant to happen, your professional liability policy would kick in if that caused your client or somebody else financial loss. And professional liability, and in any liability policy, one of the biggest pluses to have a policy is the defense. Even if you didn't do something wrong, it's the defense against those acts that can cost your business so much money. Cyber insurance is another thing that I talk about a lot when we talk about hijacking, spoofing, when we deal with our software that comes along with operating UAS. If you have bad actors that get in and can cause you issues, that's cyber insurance is a very specific type of coverage that can be really, really important. And then, then we're going to talk about workers' compensation, business auto, employee benefits, and inland marine that are all kind of full policies that really can round out a risk transfer program. Can you click through, Colin? So we're going to start with aviation liability. So it's a two-part policy. So there's the liability and then haul coverage. Okay. So this policy covers your drone operations while you're in the air. It protects against all your physical loss or your damage risks. And excuse me. This can also provide coverage for your payload attached to your UAS, and it does cover some of your premises liability, which we'll get into in a little bit too. A couple of important parts about this that are really important to think about. Coverage in the air is worldwide. So if you're doing operations overseas, well, that doesn't cover, aviation liability doesn't cover anything on the ground overseas. While you're in the air, it does. It is a worldwide policy. Couple other really important parts when you're applying for aviation liabilities. All your waivers need to be submitted for approval, and all pilots providing commercial operations do need to be Part 107 certified. Okay, Colin. Okay, so what types of UAS are eligible for coverage? So we often think, when we think about types of UAS, we think of fixed wing or rotor, and while those are very important, there are policies that cover all sorts of different aircraft. But one of the things that is important in any aviation liability policy is to understand that you have a need to be, to have an insurable risk that you are responsible for. So there is a difference between owned and non-owned coverage. So if you have a company where you operate others' drones, even if it's in a training capacity, in a very secure type environment, you do need to have specific coverage if your operators are covering, or I'm sorry, your operators are flying non-owned coverage. Okay, and although it is a very specific coverage, I mean, most policies do have that language in it, but we do have to make sure that language is in it, and that is an exposure that you have. The size of the aircraft is important. I think everybody here can probably understand that we've got that kind of regular 55-pound and below and 55-pound and above. And that really can change the coverage that you have, specifically because it usually changes the operation that the UAS is performing. And so when I say that, the operation that the UAS is performing, so whether or not you're doing research, testing, egg, delivery, whatever it may be, explaining what you are doing with your drones is extremely important, and having that conversation with your risk manager. Who qualifies as a pilot? So again, all commercial policies do require Part 107 certification. And when we talk about your pilots on your policy, we need to be very clear which are employees of the company versus contractors that you may subcontract out to. And the reason why this is really important is because of contract language, and contract language within the policy. If you talk about having a certain safety program in place and that's how you're rated, then if you operate with 3/4 contractors, how is their safety programs? How are they maintaining their operational ability? And so it's really important to make sure that that information is all very much organized. You can move a little, yeah, thank you. Okay, so when we start the application process for an aviation liability policy, obviously underwriters want to know that all your pilots and all your operations are following FAA regulations. That's obviously an important thing for everybody to know. But the real, I'll get into that in the next one, I apologize. But the next one is flight hours of pilots on specific aircraft. So when you see an application, that'll be something that they're going to ask, not necessarily that every pilot has a lot of hours on a specific aircraft, but that you do have at least one pilot that has a decent amount of hours on a specific aircraft. And the larger and more specific aircraft require more specific flight hour parameters. They also want to know the year, the make, the model of the UAS, and any payload. Payload, as we all know, can be far and away the most expensive thing that's up in the air. And we really want to know specifically what payload that is. And for you, that's really important because it all comes down to if there's a claim, right? So if you switch out a payload for another, we really want to make sure that we know what's in the air so that if there is a claim, you can be reimbursed for the proper piece of equipment that was flying. You can move on a little bit. Colin, please, thank you. So the cost new of the UAS and the attached equipment payload must be listed separately. Quite often, I end up getting a whole, separate file of the corresponding values and with the serial ID numbers of the equipment, depending on the size of the operation. The cost new of the UAV is typically considered the insured value of the UAV or the cost to replace the UAV. So it's an interesting point that I want to do as well here, and we'll get into products and completed coverage in a bit. But one of the things, if you are modifying, and a lot of people do modify their UAS for their specific operations, we do need to have information on how those are modified. Again, it comes back to making sure that, if there is a loss, that it's the cost to replace what was lost to be what we call indemnified. And again, I get into the description of the operation. So it's not just, hey, we have 15 drones and they're going to go all out and look at power poles. Where are the operations taking place? How many drones will be in the air at a certain time? Do specific drones correspond to specific operations? And all of this can help not only in a physical damage loss, but for liability as well. We don't want to have you pay, for example, if you have 4 little DJIs and then, a 80-pound drone, you don't want to be rated for all of your drones being the 80 pounds, because that specific UAS is only used for certain operations. So it may seem a little invasive sometimes, the information that I ask, but it is all to make sure that, in these instances, that you are being rated, which is what goes into the cost of your insurance, for your specific operation. And this is when I quite often get into conversations with clients or potential clients of not what you want to do eventually, but what the operation is now. That is one thing that underwriters, first thing that underwriters do when they get a submission is they go in and say, oh, okay, here is their website. And if your website explains everything you want to be doing, but not necessarily what you are actually doing, that can be a red flag. Because then they'll say, oh, well, it says that you're going to do this. I don't see that you've applied to say that you have a BV loss waiver yet. And it's harder to walk that back than explain to, your risk manager, hey, this is where we see ourselves. We're in the process of applying for this waiver, but we're not quite there yet. And so that's why those conversations are really, really important. And going back to that operations, each operation is rated a little bit separately, right? Not, whether it's aerial inspections, if you're providing security, search and rescue, all of those operations are not created equally, and they would be, and if you are doing a full service operation, I like to separate those out into the percentage that you do those operations, so that you, again, your most expensive operations of security or search and rescue, you're not being rated off your most expensive operation, if that makes sense. Okay, Colin. So when I said about insurance policies, your first page of your insurance policy when you get it talks about your operations, what you do. And then the next part of it talks about exclusions. So these are some common exclusions in an aviation liability policy. Expected injury or intended injury. I run into that a little bit when I had a client about 6 years ago. They'd been in an FAA program, and they were testing they were purposefully doing their parachute crash testing. And they had a question about how that was going to be covered. Well, that wasn't going to be covered under their aviation liability policy, because it was expected or intended injury into your in this case, physical damage of your drone. Workers' compensation or employer's liability, and employer's liability covers companies against costs and claims by employees that are not covered by workers' comp, but those are separate policies, so aviation liability excludes that. Damage to property owned, occupied, rented, or used by the insured or in the care, custody, control of the insured. So that would be proper, that'd be real property on the ground. And so that wouldn't be covered. The policy does not include costs for, most policies do not include costs for search and rescue operations. That can be something that can be endorsed back onto a policy, but if they're attempting to search and rescue as far as, that's a very specific operation that is not normally covered. So it's something that you can be endorsed onto a policy. And then asbestos, so this is a pollution, asbestos, noise, pollution, contamination, nuclear risks, and munitions. So this is, we can get into a little bit of a conversation about Part 137 here. One of the things for Part 137, dispensing of chemicals and ag products, you know, that most aviation liability policies exclude that. And again, when I talked about policies, the second part was exclusion, and then the third part is endorsement. You're gonna have some very basic endorsements that you can add pollution and contamination, whether it be accidental disbursement or chemical drift risks. Those would more than likely need to have a whole separate policy, depending on the operations again, right? We need to have a whole specific policy to cover it, and that would be called a pollution policy. But again, that would be specific risks that for your operation. Okay, Colin, you can.
And we do have a couple questions too, Stacy. One being, what is a good amount of hours in reference to the aircrafts?
For a pilot?
I believe so. I believe that's what they're referring to.
We want to make sure, you know, that there is somebody on the policy that has had at the basic level. Obviously, when you have a policy, it needs to have at least one drone, right? So if we're talking about a brand new policy, we'd like to see at least 20 hours, which, you know, isn't real difficult on the basic policies or on the basic drone, the first drone. As you add more in, as you add new drones that possibly you don't have, they want to make sure that you're building testing hours before those go out and be in a more, you know, whether or not it's being used with a different waiver, that you're building in some test hours before you go out and provide commercial operations. And so there's not any specific, I would say the larger the drone, the more complicated operations, the higher of the flight hours that they want to see. And again, depending on how many pilots you have, they want to make sure that there's at least one training pilot that's had more hours. Does that make sense? I don't know why I was...
That makes perfect sense. We had another two-part question. Are the policies that are written, oh, sorry, give me a second here. Another one just popped in. Are the policies that are written for a company that has their employees use the employees' personal drones for contractual business options or operations? And then what policies provide the most protection for companies and employees that operate independently?
Okay, I'm going to have you repeat the second one in a second, but so the first question was, does a policy cover if an employee-owned drone is used in their commercial operations? Is that, am I saying that right? Okay. Yep. So that goes a little bit into that coverage that we talked about, which was owned and non-owned coverage. Ideally, what we would like to see, if it's an employee-owned drone, either A, they have their own policy, or B, there is some contract in place that either leases the company, either a subcontractor contract or a lease for the commercial operation, because you need to have some insurable value in that drone, right? For it to be covered. So employee-owned drones are not in commercial operations, they're usually frowned upon. There can be some endorsements onto that, but they'd like to see, you know, kind of why that's not written out in a contract that they're being used, because the short simple answer is, if it's a non-owned drone, they don't want to see that it's a regular occurrence without some sort of contract in place, and then the contract would require for them most often to have their own insurance. And then can you repeat the second part of the question?
Yep. It was just, what policies provide the most protection for the company and employees?
Well, we're going to get into kind of the full, what I like to say, the full package here. But aviation liability, you know, mainly covers you in the air. We're going to talk about aviation operations liability, which is what your full operations policy, and that'll probably answer a little bit more. And then, you know, we're going to talk about workers' comp benefits. So I'm going to revisit that question at the end, if that's all right.
Sounds great.
Okay, we can click over to another one. Okay, so liability coverage for aviation policy. So you can get liability coverage from anywhere from $1 million up to $25 million. And that is, you know, your occurrence. So an occurrence limit is, well, it can be occurrence and then there's an aggregate. So an occurrence limit is, for, say, let's just say it's $1 million in occurrence limit. Any one claim can have a loss up to $1 million. And most people kind of laugh and say, what on earth are we going to have that's $1 million? And I always refer people back to defense costs, because, you know, I can always know that if I'm in a room, I'm not usually the most disliked person there if there's a lawyer beside me. Because we all know that whenever you hire a lawyer, it can get really, 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 really expensive, even if you did nothing wrong, right? And limits up to the 25 million, you know, again, we don't see those all the time, but depending on the energy companies that you're working with, or you know, depending on the companies, I have seen limits requested up for that. That is something that I work with a lot of my clients about, their contracts that they sign, and really making sure that they're not, that the people requesting those limits within a contract are in fact using limits that are more for the operations that they're providing, right? The scope of work that they're providing. In the last 5 years, I've been able to talk to a lot of, you know, specifically energy companies tend to be the ones, the kind of the worst players in that field for asking for really, really high limits. And most often the reason is because they've just flipped over a contract that was for manned operations, right? And the liability losses from a manned aircraft can cause quite a bit more damage in that. Medical payments is another line on an insurance policy that I like to talk to people about. Medical payments is a separate limit that it's a no fault payment. So if something happened and a bodily injury occurred and somebody had to go to the ER, no fault will pay up to $5,000 per occurrence. Okay. Again, I like to point out that aviation liability policies are worldwide, and that can cover, you know, if you're going to a show in France, it can, and you take part in a fly-in there, that will cover your drone while in the air anywhere in the world. So, you know, the insurance carrier's duty to defend ends when the limits of the policy are exhausted. I always want to point out some specific wording in insurance policies where every insurance policy, whether it be professional liability, general liability, cyber liability, all have wording whether the defense is within or outside of your limit. And I always try to get, as much as I can, defense outside the limits, which means that's separate. So if you have damages that you have to pay of $895,000, it's only going to leave you, you know, $105,000 for defense. I want to make sure, as much as I can, that your defense is outside of those limits. So the, you know, the insurance carrier duty to defend ends when the limits are exhausted. If you have the wording in a policy that talks about your limits being exhausted after that, defense outside continues on those limits. And then, oh, I see it's kind of cut off a little bit here, but limited premises liability. So premises liability is a specific coverage item in aviation liability policies, but I always want to point out that that is very, very limited. Premises liability would be, you know, where you do your operations, you know, if it's an office, but it is very specific, and in aviation, those don't change. And that's why it's really, you know, premises liability in a typical manned aviation policy would be where you would store your drone and maybe have your plane, you know, in the hangar. Insurance policies, unmanned insurance policies haven't really updated a lot, because unmanned operations, your airport is wherever you are flying. And premises liability isn't extended in an aviation liability for, you know, multiple locations. You can sometimes get extensions on that, but for drone operations that are more than a aircraft, it really, you really are operating out of the scope of that premises liability. So when you have agents, insurance agents, that talk about, oh no, this is a little bit of a premises liability, you don't need any other policy, that's really misleading, because it's a very, very small scope of premises liability of covering your operations on the ground. The premises liability is not meant to cover all of a UAS, a full UAS operation business. They're what we would call their general liability exposure. Next slide. Did we go back? Keep going.
There we go.
Okay, so we've talked about the aviation liability portion, right? The other portion of an aviation liability, and I know it's kind of a misleading policy, right? Because it's aviation liability, but the second part of an aviation liability policy is the hull, or the physical damage cover portion. And again, this is physical damage or hull coverage to your, this would be, I like to explain it kind of like if you have an auto policy, right? An auto policy covers, You can have liability only, or what we like to call full coverage. Aviation liability policies are the same thing. You can have just the liability portion, or you can also have hull or physical damage portion. And a lot of people say, because the hull or physical damage portion of an aviation liability policy tends to be where the costs come in, right? And most people would say, I'm just flying a small drone. It's not really worth the cost. And I do have a lot of people that is the case. But one of the caveats to that is, if you do not insure your drone for physical damage, you will not be able to cover any of your payload. The vast majority of aviation liability policies, you do need to cover a drone in order to cover that payload. And again, like we said before, you can have a $1,000 drone, but you can have very easily some $35, $65, $75, $100,000 in payloads attached to that. And in order to have that payload coverage, you need to have that attached to a drone that is covered. There's a couple different ways that you can cover your drones. You can either cover them individually, or you can cover them as a fleet. So you can do it and say, okay, I want to blanket coverage 20 drones, and at the beginning of the year, you put the drones, you put your serial number, the flight hours on that, and as long as they're of like kind and value, you can swap out the drones throughout the year without informing your insurance agent if you schedule them as a fleet. And that gets to be a little bit more on the organizational side, easier on the organizational side. Just if you have a larger fleet and you're doing different operations, and as long as they're used for the same operation and are as like kind and value, you can switch those out throughout the year. That being said, if there's any modifications that increase the value of a scheduled drone, it needs to be reported. Again, in the case of a claim, I would hate to have had a very modified drone that really increased the value go up in the air and not have had that be reported. I quite often have questions about that. Is there any questions about a fleet versus an individual? And I can come back to that later if there aren't any right now.
The only question we have two of them currently. I volunteer with search and rescue, sometimes use my personal Phantom 4 for nearby LOS flights as a Part 107. Will personal and UAS insurance cover me in that capacity? I am certain the county is not ensuring that I use this for a personal drone.
Can you repeat that one more time, Colin?
Yeah. I volunteer with search and rescue and sometimes use my personal Phantom 4 for a nearby LOS flight as a Part 107 RPIC. Will personal UAS insurance cover me in that capacity? I'm certain the county is not ensuring that I use it for a personal drone.
Maybe that would be something that you could get a hold of me after this, the person that put in the question, because that can be, I'm not sure what you have for personal drone use coverage, and those coverage portions are a little bit different. So you can get a commercial policy for volunteer type operations, and that would be just more of a very specific question that we would have to go over.
All right, and then one other question that was said, are there policies for businesses that train people to fly UAS?
Yes, absolutely. Those operations training is a very common a very common exposure, and depending on what your training, your trainees are what their operations are and what you're training them to do would be how they would be rated, but absolutely. If we want to just go through, keep going through, because I need to kind of move a bit quicker apparently. So the exclusions, so loss of use, in a commercial policy, you know, there's in non-aviation commercial policy, there's quite often loss of use clauses, and that's not something that is covered in a hull policy. Any residual decrease in value after repairs are completed as an exclusion. That can be something that can be endorsed back on. Mechanical breakdown, you know, kind of similar to what like an auto policy, those wouldn't be covered in an aviation liability policy. Okay, so if we can just skip through. So this is a very stereotypical, this was from Chubb, but UAV hull and liability applications are very similar. Kind of whatever company, this is kind of what one looks like. Okay, we want to skip through to another one. So aviation operations coverage, and this is what I had talked about. The reason why an aviation operations policy is in there is an option is because general liability policies, like I said before, the vast majority of commercial carriers exclude all aviation operations. We are starting to see some carriers that they don't take the exclusion back. They don't take the exclusion off, but they do endorse some use on. But the vast majority of those are very specific operations, very simple operations, and do not cover the main operations of a UAS business. Although when you see an aviation policy application, which I'll show you in the next slide, they were built originally as airport policies. So some of the time you'll have questions and it won't really make sense, you know, and we can put non-applicable on a lot of them, but because they're built as airport policies, because the general liability of a UAS company really is, you know, you're operating small little airports as far as insurance companies are concerned. And when I talked before about premises liability, just like general liability policies, aviation policies were not meant to provide full coverage for full UAS operations. They offer more what we talk about with the products and completed operations coverage. So products and completed operation coverage helps cover liability claims that result from your business's products or your operations that were done away from your location. So if you've modified any drones and have a pass-through manufacturing exposure, this is really, really important, as well as any personal or advertising injury coverage as well. You know, you use your drone video, you know, you use drone video in your operation, and somebody doesn't like that you had some of their land or their person in there, this would be something that would cover you in that case. Okay, we can click through again, Colin. And then, yeah, so premises and property, this is the application. So it's a little bit more, there's 4 pages, so these are the first 2. So it talks about how many drones you have out there, what their operation is. You click through the next one, Colin. It's just a little bit more of a in-depth application. It talks about any contractual obligations that you may have. Quite often they want to see the insured, the insurance portion of a contract that you are going to sign or that you put out. It wants to know the scope of work that you're going to be responsible for. Okay, you can click through. Professional liability, I would say, is, you know, the third most important policy that drone operation can have. It can also be called errors and omissions coverage. It really protects your company if you're sued for negligently performing your services. So this is what covers what you are doing, not just the flying, but what service you're offering, right? And again, we know we can get pulled into a lawsuit even if we haven't made a mistake. So this is really what's going to help cover that. If there wasn't, this one does not need to have, you know, the physical damage or the bodily injury. This is going to cover, you know, if you made a mistake or they're alleging that you made a mistake that can cause them financial loss. And again, that defense inside and outside of limits is really, really important in professional liability. One thing that I do want to say is that this is the coverage, and we've really been working on this, but this is the coverage that has been least developed for UAS operations within the insurance industry, and why I always liked to really talk to people about what they're hoping that this will cover, so we can really, really make sure that, you know, the exclusions and the endorsements are correct in a professional liability policy for what your operations are doing. Okay, if you want to click through. Cyber liability. Again, when we're talking about the aviation and technology worlds colliding within a UAS business, and drones are at risk. As much as we'd like to say we're as safe and our software is as protected as it can be, they are at risk of being hacked and operated remotely, just for the pure nature of what an unmanned aircraft is. So if you don't have cyber liability, you could be held liable and have to have the financial burden of any property or damage that is incurred by a hacker. And cyber liability insurance can pay for the cost connected to cyber attacks on your drone and computer infrastructure, including your data breached, including any information you have on any clients or any of their personal information. Cyber liability policies are put in place to help indemnify you, to really help you get your business back up and going after an act by a bad actor. If you want to click through, I apologize, I'm kind of getting right down to it. Workers' compensation policy, those are really important as you make your, as you ramp up operations and really start adding more personnel. One of the things that I really want to make sure that people understand in this day and age, as we have employees all over the country, we really make sure that our workers' comp policy is very state driven. You know, in North Dakota here, we have monopolistic state, and that work comp is run through the state, through WSI. But as you have employees in different states, different policies do need to be put into place. Okay. If we can click through again. So some of the additional policies that I really think go into, you know, business auto, that's one that we see a lot in contractual obligations. There is covered if you are not using a company owned auto. Let's just say your company doesn't own any autos. You can do what's called hired and non-auto that protects the company. If employees say are using their own auto, that doesn't cover your employee's own personal vehicle, but it does protect the client or the company against any liability. Inland marine can help any equipment that your company uses that travels from from place to place, whether it be items in a trailer for operations, or specific physical pieces of equipment that move. Umbrella excess coverage. If you are being asked to have higher limits, $5 million limits, umbrella or excess coverage can really provide higher limits at a reduced rate for going on top of your primary coverage. We just have to really make real specific point of looking to make sure that in your umbrella coverage that there are no specific exclusions for unmanned operations. And then I included employee benefits coverage in here, specifically because, again, as people ramp up operations, and it might include employees in different areas of the country, really big things to watch out for is there are different states that have very specific laws about what you have to offer for employee benefits in that state. So, for example, I had somebody I had a company that had a employee in New York. New York, California have very specific benefits requirements that you do have to put into place for your employees, and if you don't, they will fine you. And then, especially the New York labor council or labor department, they will fine you, and they will fine you until you get that for thousands of dollars, and for even an employee for months until you get that coverage in place. Okay, if you want to click. Oh, so we talked a lot about contracts and insurance agreements. Again, when we had talked about subcontractors carrying their own coverage, that's really important to protect your own liability. But also, if you have subcontractors, most of your carriers are going to require that you do have your subcontractors carry their own coverage. Like I talked about with the umbrella, your higher limits, if via contract you need to have $5 million limits or $10 million limits, you don't always have to carry that on your primary coverage of aviation or aviation operations liability. Those primary limits can be achieved by combining the two and can help you in a cost-saving situation. And again, we talked about contracts and how, like originally, many of these contracts that people are seeing were created with manned aircraft in mind. Coverage limits can be too high, and contractors can be negotiated. Ask your risk manager for help. But a lot of that has to happen before you sign the contract. And that's one of the things that I often ask for really good communication with my clients. Before you sign a contract, let me look over the insurance requirements so that you're not signing something and trying to go back on that after. Can you click one more time? So obviously I kind of hurried up towards the end there, but the better understanding of UAS insurance will allow you to run your risk management program, and knowing how you want to ramp up your operations in the next 5-10 years. I understand that it's not always in the budget to have 6 policies in place, but as you start to grow your operations and put contracts into place, understanding what you want to transfer that risk out versus what you're going to self-insure, which is when you don't have a policy in place to cover something. Understanding the differences between risk transfer and self-insuring are really important to ramping up operations. And as operations and BV loss, become more of an everyday, I do believe that liability insurance, it's just a matter of time before it becomes a requirement. And as BV loss becomes a thing, especially in North Dakota, it's going to attract a large audience. And that's when the risks become higher as you get busier skies. So that's all I really had. I apologize for going over. Thanks for those that stayed. I am more than happy to answer any questions, any specific questions now, or if you want to email me or have a conversation. This is what I specialize in, and I really like to be able to make sure that, as small businesses grow, we take the risk out of the owners and the individuals and really try to pass that on. So that's it. And I apologize for going over.
No, thank you so much, Stacy. We do have a couple questions here, and this will be recorded for those that were asking about it. Our first question is, do you insure first-person view drones such as the DJI Avata or home-built FPV drones used for commercial operations?
I mean, say that again.
Do you insure first-person view or FPV drones such as the DJI Avata or home-built FPV drones used for commercial operations?
Yes, you can do well, as we say, home built or put together. I mean, that is still absolutely. I mean, then we talk about the value is what needs to be more of an agreed value at that point in time. But the vast majority of drones are modified, and the insurance industry is willing to work with that. We just need to come up with an agreed value, and figure out the value of the drone. And again, it all comes down to operations.
Awesome. We have 3 more questions here. Will another professional liability policy ride over the aviation policy?
That is something that I would have to look at. Do they have specific, it all comes down to the language in a policy. And that's most of the time what people think of as the very boring part of my job. But I really like to delve in and see what a policy really says, because again, you're not going to find out what it doesn't cover until the 16th or 82nd page. So it can, because we know that UAS operations are complicated businesses, and so sometimes they can. Although I have had in the past, I have had to put to place 2 different professional liability policies to make the gaps in coverage be something that my client feels that they could deal with and what they would be, comfortable with the gaps. So it kind of depends. I know that's a crappy answer, but yes.
Next question, does the policy always cover drones on water?
Over water?
It says on water. It might mean over water.
I don't want to say always, because there are a lot of different policies out there. They're going to specifically ask you, most when you first start, they're going to specifically ask you, because that is a separate risk. So they're going to ask you where your operations take place. If it was something that you didn't, if you didn't disclose that information at the beginning, I'm going to say that there's less of a chance. But most of the time, no, I'm not even going to say most of the time, because that could get me into trouble. But again, I'd have to read the policy information on that, but I'd be more than happy to read over a different policy.
All right, and then the last question we have here, it's kind of a long one. How does UAV insurance cover loss of property from UAV battery fires? Are those common claims or battery fires rare on claims. I'm careful to not charge when no one is present, and charging and storage is inside a firebox, but you never know.
That is one of the most common claims. So yes, it does. And you can even get some of that in the premises liability. Again, it depends on your operations. That's why I'm a bigger fan of the AVOL policy, because that is definitely a big part of it. It can be covered under the premises liability. That's one of the biggest risks that insurance companies see when they look at a drone company and when they talk about safety programs, they want to see that you have a plan in your power supply and how that's looked after. But yes, that is definitely a covered item.
Awesome. Yeah, and then yes, this will be recorded, and we'll post it on our YouTube afterwards. So if you do want to see this again, or there's information that maybe just flew by a little too fast, this will be all recorded. But that's all that we had for today. Stacy, thank you so much for doing this for us. And then her information's up as well, so feel free to get a hold of Stacy if you need help on your insurance needs.
Thank you.
Have a great day, everybody.